This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. Those of you that follow us might notice my new sort of Sean Connery look. This is something you better get used to. I think it's like we changed the branding of the show. I guess we're going to change a little branding of the host. So I hope it's not too stark of a change, but I'm looking forward to the next phase. So anyway, today's show we're going to talk about a topic that is certainly impacting boards these days, and that's cybersecurity. And we want to sort of tackle the question about what boards should know about cybersecurity. And joining us, that will be our expert for today's show, is Jim Noble, who is the former Chief IT Strategy Officer for GM and at one time for BP. He also serves as an advisor to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and also is currently working with the Advisory Council. And Jim, it's with all this experience that it's a pleasure to welcome you as our expert today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So, first of all, this is a topic that is not familiar to most corporate board members, but our point to this show is that it needs to be. And maybe since the world of IT and social media is gaining such steam, maybe we should first see if we could define what the risk is of this new paradigm, okay, this digital paradigm, and then sort of take a look specifically sort of at the director's part of that and why they need to be sensitive to what you and I sort of reference as the perfect storm in IT. So maybe that's a good place to start.
Good, and let me start, TK, by saying I would not expect board members to be fully alert to the challenges of cybersecurity. This is a new threat. And whereas board members are very familiar with political risk and economic risk and brand risk, the risk of cybersecurity didn't appear anywhere on their radar screens until quite recently. So, for example, Lloyd's Risk Register annually surveys chief executives, and 5 years ago, cybersecurity was not on the top 30 corporate risks. This year in 2013, when they did the same survey of 600 global CEOs, cybersecurity ranked number 3 of all risks. So the CEOs have woken up. Even, might I say, the CEO of the United States has woken up because President Obama has made it clear that he believes that this is a real and present threat to the prosperity of the United States. And as many of you will probably have noticed, when the Wall Street Journal recently published an article on its website about the US military options in Syria, the Syrian Electronic Army proceeded to take down the New York Times website and denied people access to it for a whole day. So, on your question, what is this risk? Well, in general, the risk is simple. Companies cannot prevent the bad guys from stealing intellectual property. And it takes people quite a while to accept that. People are in denial and they believe that they can protect their assets, but in reality, it's impossible to keep the bad guys out. Ask the White House, who've tried very hard. Ask NASA. Ask the Jet Propulsion Lab. None of them can keep the bad guys out. So that's the reality. For a board member, the reality is, what would you think if your next quarter's results got into the wrong hands a day or two before they were publicly announced? What would you think if your board minutes got into the wrong hands? What would you think if a merger or an acquisition proposal fell into the wrong hands? What would you think if your brand image was damaged? And a classic example is Sony, who lost the IDs and passwords of a large number of their users. What if you discovered that your research and development was being stolen by somebody else? So board members have a very significant duty here of care. And finally, you called this the perfect storm, which is, of course, when three weather systems coalesce and cause a very unusual event. Well, in cybersecurity, we have three weather systems coalescing. The first one is companies' defenses are actually lower than they have been historically. Companies used to be islands, and they would build a fortress. Today, you cannot run a company with a fortress mentality. You have to interoperate with your business partners. You have to allow your employees to access from a hotel room, from the airport lounge. And so companies, I now call it, are a permeable membrane. Things get in and things get out. Second issue is that the attackers are much more sophisticated and stealthy. So the attackers, instead of wanting to make a political statement, instead they are trying not to be discovered. And the third issue is, this is a catch-22 risk category. So normal risk, then you do something about it. You would, if you were attacked, you would find who was attacking you, and you would prevent that happening. Like physical security, if somebody broke into your premises, then you would go after that person. You can't do that in the cyberspace. If the US gets attacked, the US cannot retaliate by attacking another nation, and you just have to accept that this is unspoken, and that's why it's catch-22, because it's such a dangerous risk, and yet it's a subject that doesn't get much publicity.
Well, you know, this comes hand in hand. When you have all these devices and everything's becoming digital and your cars and everything happens, all those are what you like to call invisible ports of entry, okay, where there is concerns. Give us a couple of examples where it just proves your point about everything being sort of open to risk and fraud.
Yes, and it's a very good point. It's not the obvious threats coming through the front door that you should worry about. It's the people coming through the basement and the attic that you should be worried about. So, for example, in one of my previous companies, the chief executive was in a stopover at Hong Kong airport. He went to the first class lounge and he used the photocopier to copy some business materials. Now, it transpires that that photocopier has a hard disk, and the bad guys target a download from that photocopier in the first class lounge at Hong Kong airport, and they make a point of stealing copies of anything that a senior person has copied. Equally, if you have a company car and you allow your smartphone to synchronize with the car, then the hard disk drive on the car contains a lot of sensitive data. And there's documented evidence that some bad guys target cars coming back off of lease from major companies, and they go and they download the data from the hard drives of these vehicles. Equally, if you have a system administrator in your company, and every company does, how can you be sure that that person is not an Edward Snowden? Edward Snowden seemed like a really decent guy, and it would have been almost impossible to anticipate that his allegiance lay with taking secret and confidential data and giving it to WikiLeaks and other organizations. And the one that scares me most, in September of this year, Motorola is announcing its new cell phone. Motorola, a Google company. It's called the Moto X, and it listens to you all the time. So if your cell phone's sitting on your desk or in your pocket, it's listening. Now, there's been quite an uproar about that intrusion into people's privacy. Let me tell you, if I could have 5 minutes with your Apple iPhone or your Android, I could make it do that. I could make it listen to everything you're saying. I could record your keystrokes. I could look at all your text messages. These are the invisible points of entry.
Well, I'm sure that comes into the category of what will now keep directors up at night. So that takes us, I want to make sure that we don't have that much time left, and I want to make sure that we talk about what boards should be doing now. So
Yes.
Talk to me a little bit about what types of questions directors should be asking management and their CIO or their CTO,
Yes.
and how do they sort of stay on top of these issues? And then I assume that you have to have a plan if you are breached, you know, what you're going to do from there. But I guess the key to this is knowing that you're breached.
Indeed, and most companies will not know that they've been breached. So the board trusts the senior IT security person in your company, often called the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer. So as a board member, you should be asking the CISO to come to present at least to your audit committee regularly, maybe even to the main board. And the first question you should ask the CISO is, what percentage of your company's IT spend goes on security? And the answer is probably going to be quite a small percentage. I think it should be at least 5% of IT spend, but in most companies it's less than 2%, which shows that they're not taking the problem seriously. Secondly, you should ask your Chief Information Security Officer, have you anticipated the likely targets? Because not everything is material. Companies have oceans of data, and most of that data wouldn't matter if it fell into the wrong hands. So you need to focus on the crown jewels of your company and make sure that your IT security people are protecting that information. Thirdly, does your company have robust policies in place? For example, password security. And that's serious because I could probably find your password not by guessing what your company password is, but by breaking into some weak organizations like social networks that don't have good security. And it's a well-known fact that people use the same password for their social life as they do for their business life, or something very close. So instead of having millions of combinations to test, I maybe only have 100. So I can probably break into your account. Does your company have robust defenses? And by that I mean you keep out the casual intruder, the pickpocket and the thief. You don't keep out the nation that is trying to get your intellectual property. That's impossible, and I'd like to reinforce that point. And finally, do you test your defenses and test your response capability? A typical IT security team might be 5 people. And these 5 people can monitor your audit logs and make sure your Sarbanes-Oxley information isn't compromised. But when they discover an attack, 5 people is not enough. Absolutely not enough. And how does your company scale up to match the challenge, to then recover from the problem and then go back to business as usual?
Well, Jim, we just do not have enough time to deal with this topic like we should. Those questions are excellent, and I know that they will be helpful to our audience because we do get questions a lot about what is the right thing to ask. So I appreciate you taking the time to come join us. We'll have to have you back again. We've seen incidences as recently as the New York Times so there's no shortage of incidences of breaches that are happening. So we'll have plenty to talk about, but thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you'll join us again next week when we'll take a look at another critical topic that will help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom. Brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.